Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from True Parley Grandmaster Foot, and it's actually part 2 of their previous prompt. I chose to break these into 2, and because Mr. Foot has requested so many of these, I decided to just spot them this one. I think this is better as 2 Parley, so we're just doing it as 2 on me. So the previous one, you don't have to have watched that, is about Divisive Works, Chaotic Art, and A Way Out. This is part 2, but again, you won't need to understand anything here. Now, in the first part, I did establish a lot of my own theory of thinking about how art creates context and what is necessary to enjoy a piece of work. We talked in that parlay a lot about what makes something, when we say divisive. Mr. Foot and I are referring to this idea that for a given work, surprisingly, some people might think it's like the best thing of all time, but then other people might think it's not just not good, but actively really bad. That's sort of puzzling on a basic level, don't you think? Like, let's talk about the Mona Lisa, for example. I feel like it isn't the most divisive work. That might be wrong, but I feel like even people that don't think it's like anything special understand that, I mean, it's like a basically good painting. You know, it's sort of hard to say that's awful. Like if someone were to say that about the Mona Lisa, I don't really believe you. It looks like a mostly functional painting, where the people who would say that it's a really incredible work of art, well, I think they would point out, we're not going to get into it here. I'm not super qualified to, but this is something I dipped my toes into at one point, and I feel like there are some decent arguments in that camp. But it's that divisiveness for something like the Mona Lisa. For a lot of styles of painting, you see what I mean? It would be kind of weird if people massively disagreed about how good it was. Disagreed a significant amount, okay. You know, some people think it's like a 6 out of 10, and other people think it's like a 9 out of 10. That's still a little bit surprising, but that's not super weird. What's bizarre is that there are plenty of works in the world where a significant number of people say it is a 10, 11 out of 10, and plenty of other people think it's like a 3 out of 10. How? What's going on? And so in the previous part, we outlined this thing where basically my thesis is that it's a matter of having the materials for the thing to be good. If it's something that's very specific, it might ask specific things of you. The creation and the audience are creating the experience together. And for something more general, well, it'll appeal to a lot of people for whom that's right where they are. They want something that's straightforward. But for people that want something specific, yeah, it truly is absent any benefits. And so, sure, it actually makes sense upon analysis that people would disagree. And there's about 2 ways that people will disagree that I can see. It's that a work is very broad and general, and it just extremely intensely bores people that are used to things that are much more specific and particular to their tastes. Or it'll be something really specific, and it requires a lot of specific experiences in one's life as sort of additional context to enjoy that specific experience, and is therefore, yes, surprisingly bad, really fails at doing what it's setting out to do for people who don't have those experiences. If you're interested in that concept more, watch the previous parlay. But anyway, we still need to gesture at that because it's going to come up here. But I think this is a significantly different approach to the subject and a very worthwhile approach to the subject. We're going to talk about a piece, an example that Mr. Foot has prepared that is both an understandably divisive work, in my opinion, and is also something that kind of addresses the you need specific materials to enjoy it thing in a way I think is really interesting. And I want to highlight that that's just my idea. Mr. Foot didn't specifically say that. You're in this parlay, in these 2 parlays, speculating about what makes something divisive and how, I guess, goodness is constructed in a piece of work. So, a very good example. Mr. Foot begins, my favorite episodic series is Cowboy Bebop. And Cowboy Bebop is one of a kind because it kind of cracked the code of this problem of a way to control the chaos or figure out how to get people to reliably have the materials to enjoy the piece of media. I will now summarize Cowboy Bebop while vastly oversimplifying and avoiding spoilers as best as possible. As someone who's seen some of Cowboy Bebop, I think you effectively did do that. No need to worry about spoilers in my opinion. Cowboy Bebop is an episodic series with 24 smaller stories about the lives of the bounty hunting crew of the Bebop spaceship. Most of the episodes tell self-contained stories about a person or target, like a bounty target, the crew is pursuing. And the stories are as self-contained to the audience as they are to the crew members. To them, it's a person they met, a target they pursued, a thing they experienced in their life. The most important moment in somebody's life was just another Tuesday from our outside perspective. The big trick of Cowboy Bebop, as you'll come to realize, is that the story of our crew is just like those episodes. In the end, Cowboy Bebop the series will be just another story about a person, another thing you experienced in your life. And in a way, the structure of the story lends itself perfectly to that metaphor, which brings us back to the beginning question of why our experience of art seems so chaotic. It seems like we massively disagree, or it's unclear how meaning is created, even though I actually think it is quite clear once you break it down, but that just takes a long time. Cowboy Bebop kind of sidesteps that question. It takes the concept of experiencing small stories episodically and maps that onto your real life by becoming a series of small episodic stories. If you watch it in its original intended format, meaning episodically, 1 episode per week, without binging it, this would have been the only way to experience it when it came out, you will have no choice but to get the message. Obviously, this does beg the question, if we're to harness or apply that idea, it might be useful to find a way to make it more likely that the audience experiences it that way. Out of the total people who've watched Cowboy Bebop, I reckon that rather few of them at this point in history watched it that way, and that's because it doesn't do anything to enforce that structure. But obviously, enforcing that structure would make it yet again more particular. You would need episodic time to keep up with the show, right? If you have time to binge something, then something about this piece of art doesn't fire if you do that, but you can still watch it currently. There's nothing stopping you from just binging Cowboy Bebop. You could make a piece of media, games come to mind most obviously, where you are not allowed to binge it. The game tries to prevent you from binging it in some way. You could probably find a way to do this with a TV series, I guess. But obviously that would also limit its audience even further. Anyway, we'll get back to that more, but just something to note. I'm not saying that you're not making a good point, just to note that obviously this is also an incomplete version of that approach, because in no way is that episodic watching a part of Cowboy Bebop in a way that can't be removed. Like, most people who've watched that show probably never knew or thought to do this, and that's not necessarily the show's fault. It's certainly not like it's not worth trying to do this for the people who would experience it as it came out on TV. Just to say that you can imagine how a work could choose to enforce that further, or like try harder to enforce that, or literally just tell people to watch 1 episode a week. Another interesting example is Katana Gatari, which I'm going to come back to later. Katana Gatari. Katana Gatari? Anyway, Katana Gatari, which I'm going to write down in my notes now. Translated roughly as sword story. Katana Gatari. Sword, tale of swords. Continuing. There's also a second layer that makes the series particularly good for rewatches, Cowboy Bebop. I have talked to many people about Cowboy Bebop, and for almost all of them, they get randomly drawn into rewatching it at some point in their life, and it's only on their second rewatch that they get it. And I believe the reason for that is that the thing you truly need to appreciate the story is some perspective of your own life. The things that seem so big back when you watch Cowboy Bebop for the first time become just like all the individual episodic stories, a thing that happened on a Tuesday. It's a story about how you deal with the things that happen in your life, and some things need to happen in your personal life for you to truly understand that. You don't need to experience X specific event or thing. I'm talking about a more general experience of life with its natural ups and downs. Right. And as a TV series, it gets a rerun every couple months or years. And when it does get that rerun and you sit down to experience it again, you will have gone through said shit in your life, and you will have the perspective to relate to those stories. That is why Cowboy Bebop is my favorite episodic series. And for me personally, it's on the same level of artistic achievement as like a Nier Automata example. Once again, you can see how this is a really useful example. You can see how Cowboy Bebop seems to be, as you argue, specifically identifying and pursuing the materials required for it to be enjoyable. It is possible to make a series that does something relatively specific, and therefore requires, according to my thesis, specific materials, perspectives that you've acquired in your life as you progress as a person. But to give you those perspectives itself in some way. Now, this isn't an absolutely flawless, pristine, crystal clean version of that experience. You're saying that to have the experience, you need to watch it episodically when it's on TV, and then like watch a rerun of it or come back to it later yourself and watch it episodically. And then because of the gap in time and the episodic nature of the show, you will notice the episodicness of your own life, which had not seemed to be so when you first watched it. Certainly, you don't need to have specific experiences from the show. You're arguing that the show does enough to create the ambiance of the episodic nature of existence that you can kind of connect it to your own experience. After all, most of the things in the show, it's sci-fi, won't be things you could easily have experienced. Even though a lot of Cowboy Bebop's setting, as someone who's watched, I'm not finished with it by the way, but has watched a little bit of it, it is often a kind of space punk setting where a lot of the places they go to are pretty close to our world or a thing that was like our world, but there is a significant layer of sci-fi technology. It's almost a little bit closer to something like cyberpunk, but with spaceships rather than like just pure, you're not thinking Star Wars, in other words, necessarily. Even though you can't have had many of those specific experiences, it's the cadence of the experiences. That's what you're arguing. And you could imagine if we were to break down Cowboy Bebop in a lot of detail, you could look into the text, such as it is, of the show, and see in what moments does the show kind of push toward that idea, or maybe not. It could be this is something that is reasonable to get from Cowboy Bebop, but the text actually doesn't contain a lot of specific like motions toward those events. For example, Cowboy Bebop is quite famous for its action scenes. It has some excellent action choreography and animations and memes, also memes. You might have a good time. You need to look it up. However, I personally also have watched enough of it to know that, yeah, there is a modest amount of the characters like hanging out and decompressing or maintaining the ship or, you know, just living their normal lives, right? There's enough of that that I would say it's at least arguable that that is something about the show. You're not just saying that is something someone could in theory appreciate. Something about the piece of media itself actually is about that. It's written into the text of the show to some extent. In my opinion, not such an extent that it is inarguable that that's not part of the show, but it's certainly debatable. Sure. And I would love to watch the rest. I definitely will watch the rest of it after this and decide on this for myself. This will be a really interesting way to think about that. I didn't think of this or know about this perspective, but I did indeed watch it semi-episodically. I have not binged it. I'm also not done with it, as I said. So, cool. Sounds like a good idea. Now, about the creating the perspective in the piece of media. Now, this is obviously really good, right? It's kind of like a tutorial in a video game. We don't assume that you've played Dark Souls before. We give you a tutorial on how to play when you play Elden Ring. Yeah, and because a lot of people have played Dark Souls before, you can also walk right past the tutorial in Elden Ring. Great, this is very good. But you can see how in a video game, that's kind of like, think about what just happened there. The piece of media is now able to adapt to people who don't have a lot of experience with it. The tutorial is pretty easy too. And people who do have a lot of experience, you can just run right out the door and go straight to Caelid, which is a much higher level zone right next to where you start, if you're way into the Souls games and you're just bored by Limgrave. Yeah, it's a great thing, and it might not seem like that amazing of a thing. In video games, it's kind of easy to do. But if you think about other media, that's actually really amazing, and other media have a huge problem with this, if you want to think of it like that. For example, let's say that you write an amazing fantasy book, fantasy series, piece of epic fantasy. Glenn Cook's The Black Company comes to mind as a very famous piece of epic fantasy that I don't think does the thing I'm about to say. You need to have certain experiences, perspectives, stocked in your life before you will enjoy this. For example, it's not very action-y paced. You know, it's about a journey. It's about war. It's about brutality. It's not really about the glory of any of these characters. It's a disempowerment fantasy. The Black Company is, not a spoiler, a story that follows the Black Company, a relatively large mercenary troupe from the perspective of one of their medics, which is a nice little twist. And he's also their analyst. Basically, he writes the history of the mercenary troop, which they maintain, because this is a low to medium magic setting as well. And it's a very like the old magic kind of setting. So if the Black Company has had a dealing with some ancient curse or whatever, you really want to be able to look that up. That's the type of thing we're working with. This is your classical D&D wizard in a tower who's got your plot coupons. Well, the Black Company figured we might as well document that shit ourselves. And so they have their own plot coupon vendor, and that's, your focus character. Pretty interesting focus character. Now, the Black Company has your shonen protagonist ace fighters. Absolutely, sure. But they are absolutely nothing compared to some of the enemies that they end up facing. The 10 who were taken. What a badass name and set of legendary villains. Glorious story. Recommended if you haven't checked it out. Or so I would say. But you need to be ready for a certain kind of story before this will be enjoyable. And I think that at the time that I read it, I was so impressed by, for me, it was the writing, because I wanted to write fiction when I grew up, when I was a wee lad of, 10 or something, such that I kind of just stuck with it. But I have to say, I really didn't get it. I was sort of lost on me. And now coming back to it, I have a totally different perspective. I don't think it's staggeringly well written. That also doesn't matter to me anymore. Like that, who cares? It doesn't matter. It's very functionally written. It's a well-written book. I have no offense, Glenn Cook. I'm just saying it's not like the most beautiful thing I've ever read. I have more perspective now, and that also isn't a good fit for a piece of fantasy, in my opinion. It's very well written, but it's it has a pace I recognize as it's character driven. It's somewhat episodic or a slice of life. It is a more linear story. It's not like Cowboy Bebop in that regard, but yeah, it's something that you would need to be willing to take your time and slow down and dig into for you to enjoy. It requires some materials that it doesn't set up. Could a book set those things up? Could a story set those things up? I think it's fair to argue that if Cowboy Bebop can be credited with being able to provide the experience Mr. Food is suggesting, it certainly isn't doing a ton to enforce that experience. It is good that it is popular and therefore reruns, and so you could watch it episodically on TV and then watch it again episodically on TV, in a few years. Certainly, that's not zero of the piece of media having it built into it that you'll have this experience, but it hardly has a tutorial for those experiences, right? And how would it? It's asking you for a tutorial of life, basically, right? So how is that supposed to work? But this isn't impossible. For example, I would say that Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, a very popular series of or loosely connected fantasy books that is extremely popular in the media right now and has kind of repopularized the certain style of fantasy, is partly popular and successful for a reason that doesn't get talked about that much, and which I'm going to make a pretty strong claim about. And it's this. The Cosmere is in a vague order. That is, they're not like all books in a series, but there is a vague sort of phase order to where we are in the overall narrative of the shared universe of these fantasy books. For example, one of the cornerstone series of the Cosmere, the Mistborn series, is designed in this really cool way. It's one planet and its fantasy society, and we follow them through 5 tech levels: medieval, industrialization, basically, Cold War era modern, so like our society 20 to 30 years ago, you could say, 30 to 40 years ago now, cyberpunk, and then the space age, with the same magic system being used in really different contexts throughout that period of time. Isn't that cool? Anyway, very cool idea for a series. So that's one of the cornerstones of the series. And so what I mean by the vague order of the Cosmere books is that you are intended to read them vaguely progressing from earlier in time to later in time. Obviously, there are some that are straightforward in a different way. They're just series, and obviously you'd want to read those books in order. So the first Mistborn series is a trilogy. Obviously, you'd read those in order. And then after reading that trilogy, read the Industrialization. Those are 4 books, so you read that cycle, of course. But then also there's like a short story collection, and it has little blurbs about each of the planets. You're meant to read these just after you've read the first thing in on that planet. So you read the first Mistborn trilogy, and then you get a little mini essay and star chart of the system that that story took place in. And there's a bunch of others. The key thing here is that there's also a really big epic fantasy series in the Cosmere. There's a lot of trilogies and standalone short stories and standalone novels and standalone novellas that are placed vaguely in the series at certain points. It's usually not of critical importance that you read them at an exact moment. People who read the Cosmere, I understand that's actually a contested subject, but just give me a break here. It's an example. I don't want to make the whole thing about this. But the key thing is, we have a couple of different kind of cornerstone series. Yes, there are some trilogies and a lot of standalone novels and novellas and short stories, but there's also the Mistborn stuff, 5 different trilogies or cycles that are different tech levels of that one planet. And then also the Stormlight Archive, which is a 10-book epic fantasy style series. The Stormlight Archive books are huge, and there are 5 of them right now. So it's a very, very long series. And the tone is that same thing, right? It's a slowly paced piece of epic fantasy. I believe that for people that don't already feel used to or accustomed to that type of narrative focus, that amount of detail spread out over a long time, that character focus rather than, some people will say like, but nothing happens, but a ton of stuff happens. It's just significantly character development and not like a ton of explosions occurred, right? I could tell you a ton of events that happen in the series, but like 2/3 of them are things that are like a character changes as a person, or they have a mundane event for everybody else, but for them it was a big deal. And you don't have to like that. I'm not saying that it's objectively good. You just have to have had these perspectives. Not necessarily, but certainly it is asking you to have this perspective to enjoy it, right? There's something in Cowboy Bebop that you are meant to get if you have had those things in your life pass you by. It is absolutely possible to just have those materials already. You're recommended the Stormlight Archive. Almost nobody in our current society thinks about recommending things this way, so they're not going to say, like, make sure that you have these perspectives before you go read it. You will go read it, and you might very well just enjoy it. You don't need the piece of media to give you the perspectives. That's not required or something. In the same way that if you play a new bullet hell game and you've played Toho before, you don't need a tutorial on how to play a bullet hell game as long as you know the controls, you're good. It's also a pretty straightforward concept in theory. Or Vampire Survivors doesn't require much of a tutorial necessarily. But that also doesn't mean it wouldn't be good to include one. Again, something like Elden Ring. The Dark Souls games have been very famous, but it's obviously still better to also include a tutorial, and then even better if you can let them skip it. How do you do that in a series of books? Well, there's a pretty interesting solution in the Cosmere. The Stormlight Archive is not at the beginning of the Cosmere. It starts after, for example, Mistborn Era 1 and some of the short stories, and most people recommend if you're going to progress through the Cosmere books, not reading it like right away or even particularly early. You would read a solid around a dozen pieces of Sanderson's writing before you got here, and none of those have this exact same focus. However, a lot of them kind of, this is the key thing, build up to it in some way. In the first Mistborn trilogy, for example, the first book is about a heist and is relatively action-y, especially for Sanderson's writing. A lot of stuff happens in these books. They can be page-turners, but like physical action and fighting. But the other 2 books in the trilogy are, significantly a terrible situation they have to untangle, wandering around looking for the plot coupons while a lot of terrible things happen along the way as they sort of Oregon Trail to hell, trying to figure things out in their world. Decent pitch for that. Please put that on the next Mistborn book as a review. An Oregon Trail to Hell, Zandy 2025. Looking forward to that on Mistborn Ghostbloods book 1. Anyway, they're that different pace. They are, whether intentionally or not, from Sanderson, a sort of bridge from your perspective where I think a large percentage of humanity would enjoy Mistborn Book 1, Trilogy 1 with no context. And then the next 2 books in the series would establish their interest in that other series. And then when they get to the Stormlight Archive, on your way reading all these books, also it's a lot of books, right? you may have become a person who would like it. Where if you had started with it, and a lot of people do, which I think is mostly unfortunate, you might not have enjoyed it. So it's a messy solution, but yeah, not bad. And you also could jump right to it. Like, now that I've said this to you, if that's what sounds appealing to you, and I do think it's overall one of his better works, provided we can take it as a given that you will like all of his books, I think it is like among his better work. So if you had those perspectives already, and that's just what you want to start with, you also can do that. The nature of the connection of the books and the order of them is that it need only be a loose order. There's only a few cases where it will just blatantly spoil something. I could easily, and by the way, private message me, if you're interested in these books and you want to jump to the Stormlight Archive, I could very easily give you a reading order where you don't spoil anything for yourself, but you get to start with those if you wanted to do such a thing. I think there's sort of like, there's no need. The other books are good too, but if you wanted to, I could easily do that. And so it's messy, right? That's not perfect. I'm tempted to say, he really likes to write forewords in his books. Could you just write a foreword where you say the thing I just said, worded to be more condensed, so that people can get the benefit of that? And in my own work, I'm inspired to do something a bit more compact, like writing a big epic fantasy series. But let's imagine it like this. So there's 10 books, and I know that a lot of people won't think they would like this, at least from the start. But according to me, there really is no you would or wouldn't like this in a cosmic sense, in a cosmere sense, if you will. Okay, I'll stop. It's only, do you have the perspective materials to enjoy this? So knowing that, what if you did something like, the series has elements of an adventure or a slice of life, an action piece of media, and a romance. There's a significant amount of romance in the series I have planned. What if you did this? Books 4 through 10 will contain all of that stuff, and might be paced slightly slower than other entertainment you're used to, taking their time. That's something I want to do in these books. That's something I like about these style of book that I've read. But books 1 through 3 are 3 introductions, each for one of the principal characters in my story. There are 3, and are each more focused on that one element of the story. One romance-focused book, one action-adventure-focused book, and one sort of slice-of-life atmospheric book. Those are more focused on that, and you can read the first 3 in any order. The trick is, you ask the audience, well, what perspective are you starting from? You think that you like romance. I'll just say, do you like romance books? They'll say, yeah, that's what I like. Now, no, it's not. That's just what they currently have the perspective for. I'm not trying to be persnickety. I, as a writer, do not believe that is a real phenomenon. You're not like forced because of something engraved on your soul to only enjoy romance books, obviously, when I put it that way, maybe. But that's how people think of it, okay? So I say, well, the first 3 books of my series can be read in any order. And you get different perspective and context depending on what order you read them in. It's completely fine to read them in any order. So if you don't care at all, I'll just choose an order, of course, right? It's nice to just say, oh, this is book 1, but then in the foreword, I'll say, hey, this is the romance-focused book of the 3. If you would like to start with something else, like go ahead and start with this book, perhaps. Or just know that if you're not getting into this book immediately, maybe you'd like to start with this one. And then people can go from wherever they are, go to the next book, and then hopefully I can kind of elide them up to the point that they enjoy the type of experience I have in mind. Again, you could imagine something like Cowboy Bebop getting a sequel, but anyway, let's just imagine this happened. I know people who like Cowboy Bebop are probably like, stop, please, no, don't give them any ideas. But sorry, but not sorry. We're doing it as an example. And then you have to wait a long time in your life. But then again, people like 20 years from now wouldn't have to wait. They can just watch the one and then the other. You could build it into a piece of media in a more permanent way, like this example of starting a big series of books with a few that can be read in any order and are meant to adapt to people's perceived specific preferences and get them to kind of bridge toward the thing that I ultimately want to combine everything into, while also allowing me to introduce things in a more granular way, right? You could imagine a series benefiting from that structure on the author's end as well. I get to introduce things in a like not chaotic way. I'm not doing everything at once. We're taking our time. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that will be effective. I feel like it isn't a bad idea. And I feel like there are plenty of examples in the media, in the discourse right now, of a piece of media that starts out as one thing and becomes something significantly different down the line. And lots of people seem to be just fine with that. It seems like as long as it was able to put a foot forward that they felt welcomed into, most people don't have like an understanding of their taste. They just have the things they know they've liked so far. And people have a tendency to oversimplify these. And that's completely fine. It's an understandable adaptation to being overwhelmed, but they're not like right that they can't enjoy anything else, according to me. It's just a matter of giving people the materials. It's also a matter of not saying that they're just like wrong or worse for not appreciating this on this level. They just don't have the materials. And if they did, they would enjoy it. There's nothing special about me. There's nothing more literary or deep or smart or noble about me because I enjoyed these Stormlight Archive books. It's just a piece of entertainment. But even if you feel like, oh, well, it's like a more relaxed piece of media, it's not rushing through everything, it's not doom scrolling TikTok. The only reason I enjoy this instead of that is because I have the context, I have the perspective to enjoy it. If you were to give someone that perspective, there's no reason they wouldn't be able to enjoy it themselves, minus a little bit of time to adapt, getting out of the habit of the thing that they were in the habit of enjoying before. Sure. But still, completely fine. And I mean, if you've got like 12 books before they have to get to that book, then they probably do have time to adapt to that. You know, I read through a lot of the Cosmere pretty fast in a cosmic, I won't say it sense. And so, sure, like for me, I was already at that place. I think I would have enjoyed all these books right from the start. I definitely enjoyed The Way of Kings, Stormlight 1, more because I read it like after I read about 12 other books in the series. And I sort of led up to that. And by the time I got there, I really enjoyed sort of the different pacing of that book. I liked it more. I think now I like it more. I wonder if I would have felt different if I'd read them in a different order. And I find myself going back to the Mistborn books, which I loved at the time. I really liked the first Mistborn trilogy especially, but finding them a little quick. Like I sort of want them to take their time a little bit more, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon. I definitely didn't think that when I first read them. I now think they're almost rushing slightly, even though I don't really think it's a flaw. But anyway, that's really interesting. You know, he caused me to notice something about that writing style within the series of books. The series of books kind of does that in a semi-reliable way. If Cowboy Bebop being aired repeatedly on TV like this is maybe a like 2 out of 10 in the it is hard-coded into the piece of media to experience it this way, this is maybe like a 6 out of 10. You might say. You are kind of loosely intended to experience them in this order, and there is like an order to some of the books in the series, so yeah, you probably will, but at the same time, also lots of people just start by reading the Stormlight Archive, which like, that's fine. I would just say, if people think like, oh, it's just boring, it's fine if you feel that way. Maybe it would be effective to try reading the other stuff first. It's also fine if you just don't like it. There's nothing like special or noble about liking that. Anyway, so I think that's the interesting thing to me, is that this is a really, really good point. There's a way that you can kind of build the context of art into a piece of art. And I would reckon that what we learned from this example is that video games are crazy in theory. You can really effectively do this in a way that it's much harder to do it in other pieces of media. It's like borderline impossible to do in a lot of pieces of media, but in video games it can be surprisingly trivial to add like an okay amount of perspective to things. You can also do things like, you want the player to play in a certain order or rhythm, you can reward that. So World of Warcraft's rested experience is the canonical example to me. In World of Warcraft, if you don't play for a little while, or you don't get experience for a while, or you save inside of an inn building for a while, I forget exactly, whatever, basically you take a break from playing for 2 seconds, please, you gain this like light blue bar over your experience, which is normally this deep purple. And this bar is double experience. Until you fill up this much of your experience, you gain experience at twice the rate. And this maxes out after you haven't played for like a few days, like 2 days. I don't remember exactly. You get the idea, and it's probably changed by now. when I played, this is how it worked. And the intention is that it's probably more fun if you don't blitz through the whole game at once, because it's a massive grind fest. But anyway, you know, if you just don't do that all at once and have like a normal life. Also, if you quit your job because you're binging this game, they can't pay the monthly fee and World of Warcraft won't make any money. So maybe your life will be better in a variety of ways if you don't binge the hell out of the game. And to support that, the game gives you a significant efficiency reward in leveling up. Now, I want you to keep in mind, in World of Warcraft, when I played originally, in original World of Warcraft, like 20 years ago, in no way did you have enough quests that you could just be doing quests like the whole way to max level. You would run out of quests. You run out of quests much less if you use rested experience like that, as you kill things for a fetch quest or whatever. You're going to be able to bridge between quests much more. The experience is significantly better if you just focus on doing it when you have rested experience. It's paced better. You will very likely enjoy that more in your life. And also, it kind of, you get a reward for it. The experience is more dense. It's kind of a better game if you play it that way in some ways. And the game, again, out of 10 maybe is like 7 or 8 out of 10, including that in the experience. 10 out of 10 would be you are not allowed to do it except in the way that the game wants you to. That would be something like making a website that releases your web series that checks your browser IP and requires you to not watch the next episode for 1 week. Well, that would be a 9 out of 10 because I can already think of how you would get around that. But whatever, you know, it forces you unless you do an intervention. 10 out of 10 would be I tell you a story verbally and refuse to speak to you for 1 week in between parts of the story. Like, you cannot know the next part of the story until in this week-long example, whatever rhythm you want the audience to experience it in. You get the point. You know, you can kind of build this in as part of a piece of media, and it is very difficult to do that in other media in a way that in video games, it's certainly much easier to do that. And it's also relatively common. We have things like usually mobile game stamina systems. The idea is that you can only play so much before you can often pay to refresh your stamina, but you otherwise need to wait to the next day to refill your stamina. And this limits how much you can play and progress, which keeps you in the game like a little bit every day rather than like in big binges. Now, this is done for various reasons that don't have to do with enjoying the piece of art, but it does also create a narrative. Because you play these games as a kind of ongoing experience, it's not a surprise that a lot of the more narrative-focused mobile games that use this structure are about you in the game being in an experience that has that time interval. Limbus Company, Arknights, and Fate Grand Order come to mind. These are all games where the story is that you are like on the land ship, Rhodes Island, or the bus in Limbus Company, or you're at Chaldea waiting for the next mission in Fate Grand Order. And when a new update comes out with a new story chapter, the characters in Fate Grand Order say, hey, hope you enjoyed the last 3 months of rest. In your real life, the next singularity is here. Go, go, go. And it's, you know, immersive in that kind of light way. Part of my late thesis for this parlay is this concept of light immersion, of creating a rhythm to the piece of media that the benefit is basically just immersion, but you don't try to push on it where the experience of the game itself never ever makes you think you're not inside of a game. You know, no UI, no things like that. We're not taking that approach to immersion. We're trying to do a thing where it kind of syncs up with the way your actual life works, and thus you can use materials created by a human living their life in the narrative in some way. Think about how far we've come, and you really have. Think about how we can finally do this next mission, and you really have waited a few days to have the stamina or rested experience or whatever it is for that mission. You can build it in that way. I'm going to refer to that as light immersion as an approach. Though maybe immersion is the wrong word because this is significantly different. I just think the benefit is overall like immersion. It's just that you don't need to do the same types of things inside of the game to create the experience. And it's also really hard to do in other pieces of media. Cool. Katanagatari example, there's not actually that much to say, but just as another example, because you're thinking, well, okay, but you've used this like episodic 1 episode a week example a ton. What are some other rhythms of experiencing a piece of media that could matter, and how would you enforce them? Well, Katanagatari is just an example. Like Cowboy Bebop, you experience it immersively. The characters are going on a journey that does take this amount of time, and Katanagatari's interval is monthly. They would do one episode a month, I believe, is how it originally came out, and the episodes are themed to that time of the year in Japan and have various like cultural and stylistic influences from that time of the year in Japan, and Shinto religion plays a significant role, I would say, in Katanagatari. As the two characters in Katanagatari collect all of the like fabled swords that they want to collect for the shogunate or whatever it is. It's immersive in that light immersion way, where it's kind of syncing up the character's journey with your own. And by the end of the time you're watching the series, you might go, wow, it's been a year just like it's been for them. And that kind of has some impact. And you feel the impact of some character developments in the show anyway, in a way you wouldn't have otherwise, because you spent a year with those characters. You feel that the same way the characters in the show do, you know, to an extent, to a greater extent than normal. But obviously, there's nothing stopping you from just binging Katanagatari. It's just that when it first came out, it was like that. And I mean, because it was monthly and for a year, that also enforces that structure a little bit more for a little bit larger of a percentage of the people who would have watched it. So I just thought it was worth mentioning. But I still personally feel like this is still no offense, it's still a really good example, Mr. Food, but still a relatively impotent way to enforce that idea. Maybe only like a 3 out of 10 or so. Let's finish up. Moving past Nier Automata. The second half of the Invisible Wall series, these parlay about the frontiers of game design, was about the question of what is next after Nier Automata. We can copy what it did and achieve good results, but where do we go next? And I've attempted to give an answer by examining these interesting new developments we see in the gaming landscape. We looked at cruel games. We looked at the different variations of outsourced art and how that brought us to layering art within art. We briefly looked at intentional boredom and leaving gaps and how that could be interesting. But if you asked me what the next big step forward will be, what the next Holy Grail would look like, I would propose that it's something like a Cowboy Bebop. It will be a game that takes something about the structure of sitting down and playing a game in a session and links that to an emotional peak in the narrative. We see some attempts and experiments that go into that direction already, like, for example, Hades trying to tell you a story using the session-based structure, although I consider that to be a failed experiment for a variety of reasons. But the first game to nail that at a certain scale and quality level will be the game that will match Nier Automata's greatness, such as we perceive it to be. This is the next big frontier of the Invisible Wall that I personally will be waiting for. That is my prediction for the future of the video game art form. Certainly, there are already games that do exactly this. I think I would agree with you that I haven't seen it done well very often, though. And there's a lot of games where I feel like, unfortunately, they actually would have done it pretty well, and it's mostly like a peripheral problem. So, for example, in Hades, I overall liked the gimmick that Hades is doing, where Melenoi and Zagreus are in the lore of the story, repeatedly doing runs, and they repeatedly die and go back to base and talk with their friends and mentors and such about what was going on. And that is part of the narrative. That's meant to be immersive in some way. Certainly, as you get boons, as you do your runs, and the gods chime in about what's going on, and the game reacts in a lot of basic ways, but it does have a lot of ways it reacts to you as you play. Does feel like the narrative is in this light immersion category. I would say the main flaw is that it really can't not interrupt you. You can't have them separate if you want them to be. And I don't prefer that. I would kind of prefer something like when you get a boon, you can have the god just send you a letter that will arrive when you get back at the end of the run, or you can experience the dialogue right there, and you can pick the style you want. Because for some people, the flow of playing a roguelike just doesn't fit with like pausing to listen to dialogue all the time. I really like that, but I definitely think that that is a flaw in that you already had a specific thing. You need specific perspectives to enjoy it. And now you have another specific thing, the very character-driven focused story that is really different. It doesn't really involve the same perspective things that you might want to enjoy it. And now you have to enjoy all of that to enjoy the story, and you can't really get one or the other out of the way. You can skip a ton of dialogue, but like, again, a way to sort of integrate that better would be better. The thing that's a shame to me is that I don't think quality is actually the primary problem, and that carries over to other similar games. In Arknights, I think that the narrative of Arknights, when it is told without too much bloat, at the moments in the narrative when it is well paced, it's a really good piece of writing at times, but the problem is really stupid. It's a really silly problem. It's translated, and they didn't time the text scroll as you read it like a visual novel to the English characters. They timed it by kind of averaging the original Chinese characters. And the problem with this is that short segments pass too short and long segments pass way too slowly. And only in the middle does it pass at the right speed. At least that's what I remember the problem being. It's been a minute since I used this because it isn't a good experience. You really have to manually click through a lot, especially when there's short lines of dialogue. The story itself, if you just read it as a book, and you can do that online, of course, is often pretty good, I think. Better than Hades' writing in many places, certainly. Though that's not an extremely high bar. I think Hades has some good moments of character writing. It's not that it isn't a problem that it is like not the best thing ever, right? Certainly, I think that some of the writing from, like, let's say Cowboy Bebop and Nier Automata is much better. Yes, there's room to improve there. The thing that's kind of a shame, but also in a way sort of exciting to me, is that the primary problem for me with the pieces of media we have that already do this is not primarily quality. It's actually just quality of life and a sort of negligence toward that quality of life. Not thinking of it as, what are the materials the audience needs to enjoy this story, and how can we avoid making it harder than it needs to be, while also trying to include the audience as much as possible by making the piece of media kind of tutorialize its own methods of enjoyment for the audience. You could relatively easily do this for these games. An intern could spend a month or two going through Arknight's story and just vaguely timing the timestamps, and it would be done. And hundreds of thousands of people could just enjoy the story being better paced for all time. This game makes how much money? This game has been going for how many years? And even more importantly, the developers of Arknights are how focused on player quality of life? They normally do stuff like this. I don't really understand why they've neglected it for just that. And the answer is very likely that they sort of, it's weird to say, but like didn't think of it. They don't think of it from this perspective where it is now obvious, I hope, to you listening to this, why I feel like it's such a shame. These pieces of media are so close, but without this perspective of what constructs the enjoyment and why people disagree so much, maybe what is missing when someone isn't enjoying it. The piece of media can't be on your side to do a better job, but objectively, it really easily could be on your side to do a better job. So again, I think it's a real shame that that isn't, I guess, like buttoned down as much as it could be. It could be buttoned down. I agree with you. I think this being done at a certain scale and level of quality will be an insanely good game, and especially a game. It'll be much easier for it to be a video game, for sure. And that is mostly it for the Invisible Wall series. Next time, I will do my best to summarize what we've done here and attempt to answer the all-powerful question of what's the point of all of this? See you next time. And indeed, we will be doing something a little special to finish out the series, so I hope you look forward to it. I hope you've enjoyed these. And if you're interested in this concept but feel daunted by watching the whole thing, well, maybe you'll be more interested once we do that little summary. You could go back and watch them if you wanted to. We'll link like a playlist of all of them in that episode. At least I would imagine that future me and future Mr. Foot will think of that. So I wouldn't worry about that. I'm pretty sure we already had one of those going. I'm sure Mr. Foot has a playlist of them. So if you would like that, I'm sure we'll have that set up. And I'm looking forward to see what you do in Parley after this as well. We've been doing this for a long time. I feel like you do Parley that are not Invisible Wall, but almost not at all, not very often lately. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more of those. Not to say I don't like these. I mean, I would be into another series. I think this is a cool idea for Parley, and you can get a lot out of the format that I've created with this structure. Like, I feel like you've done a really good job maximizing the value of Parley as a format. So I guess also thank you. This is a product ultimately that I offer. And while it's a lot of fun for me, you made it into something pretty cool. So thank you for doing that. Looking forward to finishing it out. Folks, if you'd like to get parlay like this yourself, it can be about anything. You don't have to write a gigantic 20-episode series. You certainly may, but you can have it be as something as simple as, what is the point of game design? Like, is there any benefit to games other than that thing that we just talked about for 45 minutes here? That's completely fine. It doesn't have to be any more guided than that if you don't want it to be. Link in the description. See you in the next one.